Good evening, welcome. This is the first evening of our spring season of Studium Generale. From now on, each and every week you can attend our lectures, our debates, our interviews. You can find them all in this booklet. You received one, I suppose, when you came in. They are in Dutch or in English. Tonight will be in English. And our moderator will be Joost van den Akker. He is our moderator because he's specialized on politics and European law. And our first topic is the Brexit. And our first speaker is Joris Luyendijk. Joost van den Akker will introduce Joris Luyendijk. And I want you to give a warm welcome to our moderator of this evening, Joost van den Akker.
Thank you very much, Ska. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Great that you have such a big audience here on quite an important topic, Brexit. 14 months from now, the United Kingdom will leave the European Union after about 46 years of voluntary membership. It hasn't been always like that. The United Kingdom voluntarily joined the European communities in 1973. And then hold a referendum, 1975. They said, we want to stay. And it looked like that for about 40 years. And you remember the referendum about 1.5 years ago in the United Kingdom when they said, we want to leave. My name is Joost van den Akker. I'm a researcher in political science at the Public Administration Department. And I started my PhD research on referendums on the European Union at the end of 2012, and it came like a kind of God's gift that David Cameron announced as British Prime Minister at the beginning of 2013, so 5 years ago from now, that Great Britain again would have a referendum on European Union membership. A referendum which actually was never from the table since the negotiation of the Maastricht Treaty, the introduction of the euro, and David Cameron never could longer resist to have this in or out referendum. And he said, we will have this referendum if I will be re-elected and if I will strike a good deal for Britain. And this deal came on the table about 2 years ago at the same time when also at Studium Generale organized an event on the Ukraine referendum which we had in the Netherlands. For tonight's speaker, we have an eyewitness who has been living in the United Kingdom from 2011 until last year, and an eyewitness from the City of London, been close witnessing what happened within England, probably also within the rest of the United Kingdom, and can explain to us in an excellent way why did Britain happen, how did it happen, and probably what will it bring to us. Joris Luyendijk, publisher, anthropologist, journalist, published famous books, bestsellers, Het zijn net mensen, people like us, swimming with sharks, among bankers. Dit kan ooit waar zijn, the famous winner of the NS Publieksprijs. And more recently, Can We Talk, kunnen we praten. He will also sign the books to be sold here after the lecture. Joris Luyendijk has also been a correspondent for NRC Handelsblad, the Volkskrant, Radio 1 Journaal. That is what I most remember when I was asked to moderate this lecture. Typical voices on Dutch radio. Lia van Beckhoven in London, Thijs Berman in Paris, and Joris Luyendijk in Cairo. That is actually how I got to know him. So I'm very proud that I may moderate this evening. And I would like to give you a warm welcome to our guest speaker for tonight, Mr. Joris Luyendijk.
Yes, well, thank you very much for having me. There we go. Yeah, this looks more serious than it is. So don't feel pity. Yes, so yeah, I'll be given around an hour to talk about Brexit, and then we'll turn it over to the floor. I was personally in favor of Brexit when I arrived in London, in the UK, in 2011. I had never really thought about the EU nor about Britain's membership of the EU. I just thought they were the sort of awkward uncle. You know, at every family gathering you have the awkward uncle who gets drunk and obnoxious, but he's part of the family, so you put up with it. And over time I began to realize that it's actually something far more sinister and cynical than just awkwardness behind what we saw. So by the time the referendum was held, when I saw the first results coming in from Sunderland, I don't know how close you followed the whole thing, but when Sunderland came in, everybody realized, whoa, Leave is going to win. I was actually fist pumping in front of the TV. I thought, yes, they're out. I was almost on my own. And so this talk is also an attempt to explain to you how and why I think it's actually a good thing. It's both a good thing for Britain, and it's a good thing for, especially a good thing for us, Europeans, that they're out. I've chopped it into 3 bits. Why it happened, Brexit, how it happened, and what now. So let me start out with why it happened. I think it's, take a little bit of a step back. I think what struck me most, I don't know how many of you are Dutch. Can I see a show of hands? Yeah, so why am I doing this in English? But there are people here, just to make sure, there are people here in English, right? Yeah, okay, so I have, it once happened that I gave a whole talk in English only to realize that there was literally nobody in the entire room. Okay. So, yeah, so why did it happen? I think the Dutch people, especially if you're sort of part of the educated middle class, the sort of people who go to Studium Generale on a weekday, I think you're quite likely to grow up with a truly Anglophile perspective. I mean, it's the BBC, and I grew up in the 80s with not Have I Got News For You came later, but the Young Ones and the Smiths were my favorite band, and there was a sense, the Americans are like the Romans, they're crass, they're very powerful, but they're also rather uncivilized, and then they're the Brits, they're like the Greeks. And I think are especially now, if you read even the Groene Amsterdammer, which I think is the last remaining serious magazine in our country, all the references are from America and Britain. It's our culture. We're standing with our back to France and Germany culturally. And so I was quite surprised to find out that when I arrived and I said, we're all fellow Europeans, they went like, no. Europe stops at the Channel. We are not Europeans. And over time I began to realize that it's first of all, it's just geography. If you are an island, your entire perspective is different. You can drive a tank from Moscow to Amsterdam or Enschede. You can drive a tank from Beijing to Enschede. You can drive a tank from Berlin, they tried it a few times, to Amsterdam. But what you cannot do is drive a tank to London. And so this sense of insulation, I mean, look at other countries that aren't in the EU. Switzerland, which is also an island, except it's separated by mountains, and Iceland. And so this island mentality is also a really proud thing. Cameron kept coming back to this. We're a proud island people. We're different. And so I think there's always been this sense that they aren't part of Europe anyway. Churchill used to say that. We're not in Europe. And that, of course, geography then translates into history. So most recently, World War II ended very differently, as we know, for the Brits than it ended for the rest of Europe. The rest of Europe was either occupied or occupier and then occupied itself. And the Brits didn't. And so I think what almost every educated, well-thinking European is brought up with is the idea that nationalism is about the worst thing you can have. Nationalisme c'est la guerre, is what Mitterrand said in the European Parliament in that very famous speech. And for Brits, that's very different. For them, for us, nationalism is what got us Hitler. For them, nationalism is what saved them from Hitler. Because they pulled together as a nation and didn't sue for peace, and ultimately were saved by the Russians and the Americans. The last bit is usually left out. But nationalism does not have the kind of dark brown connotations that it had, at least until very recently, in Europe. And so that translates in all sorts of little things, but add them together, and it becomes quite telling. So, for example, I was in Passendale earlier, is where one of the biggest battles in World War I was waged. insane amounts of people killed. And the director of the local museum told me how after World War II, France and Germany began to commemorate the Bassendale battle together. So they would never have any kind of commemoration without making sure that at least there were representatives from the other country. So it could never degenerate into a nationalist, jingoist fest. You know, you always make sure that perpetrators, victims, whichever way you see yourself, are present at in the same place. The Brits would never join. They were invited every time, they never come. They never sent any invitations themselves. They keep better care of the graves than all the other nations, but they will not join other European nations in commemorating the war. This is a British thing. And so nationalism it's almost innocent in a sense. That often I would be really shocked. I was always working for The Guardian, which I assumed would be very close to me and its progressive outlook, but there too, nationalism is not a bad thing. And so, of course, the case for the EU is nationalism is a thing of the past. It's also the most dangerous thing there is. If we pool resources and make sure we realign national interests the way we've done with the EU, then there will never be war again. So that case just doesn't fly in a country that doesn't think nationalism is bad. Go back a little further. Empire. The British Empire left the Brits with the Commonwealth, lots of different countries that they still have quite deep relations with, as well as the Anglosphere. And so as a Brit, a British playwright, a director, a writer, a poet, your natural market is America. And so they are standing with their back to Europe, the way the Dutch are standing with their back to France and Germany. And so I think it left, I think the one natural resource that the Brits have is their language, which they spread everywhere, which gives them a huge advantage, as well as their law system. And so if you pull all this together, the Brits have options that many other European countries don't have. And so they also, if you look at the country that is the most popular country for immigration for Britain is, anyone knows? Over the past 60 years, so what country that Britain lose the most people to through emigration? Australia. And so ask Brits where they have studied, and they will mention the Commonwealth: New Zealand, Australia, Canada, America. That's also where their intelligence services cooperate with, and that's where the mindset, the outlook is towards. And so nobody reads any foreign languages. And at The Guardian, even at The Guardian, which is supposedly the most pro-European newspaper in Britain, nobody knew French, nobody read French. Same for Germany. And I would literally have the deputy editor of some high-ranking people coming up to me at some point and saying, "Yeah, but I mean the EU, that's just Germany's attempt to win World War II, right?" And you're like, whoa, where do I start? And so that's the empire. And another thing is that the Dutch don't feel guilty about their empire like the Brits, but they're not proud of it either. In Britain, empire is a positive thing. This is why the European Union is never ever called an empire. It's never called imperialistic. No. Because we were the empire. The empire was good. And in history, the way history is taught broadly is that the empire was what it was, and it was strong as it was, thanks to free trade. And this is a really important point. It's thanks to free trade, the empire was big. It wasn't because of plunder, pillage, occupation, and distortion, but it was thanks to free trade. And so, were Britain to leave the EU, it could again embrace free trade, and it will be an empire again. There were serious pieces in The Spectator, for example, arguing that Britain could be the third economy in the world as soon as they left the EU, because it could be return to the days of the empire by embracing free trade. And the fact, for example, that India was the second biggest economy, the area, before the Brits came, and it was the poorest country in the world after the Brits left, those sort of things are simply left out. And when my children went to school, they were taught the Brits discovered Australia, even though there were already a few Dutch people there. So World War II, empire, which left Britain with London. I mean, it's a fantastic city, and you'll have people from so they have special relations with Hong Kong, with with lots of African countries around Zimbabwe, South Africa, then the Caribbean, then of course Canada. There are long-standing ties with Russia. It's so much more international and global than most European cities. Even Paris is so much more inward-looking. I think Paris is closest to London in its ties to Africa, but the Brits have these ties across the world. And so I think this gives them a sense of just, that we cannot be reduced to our European membership. And then going back even further is of course the Anglican Church. Well, an element that I'd completely missed before I came, but that's a big thing. The idea that Europeans will always try to centralize power and then control Britain. And that's the Catholic Church. So you had a whole range of Anglican pundits who came out in favor of leave, and their argument was essentially the EU is a Catholic organization. It's like the Vatican. It's opaque. It's ambivalent. You just don't know what's going on. But ultimately, you get shafted by the Catholics. And again, where does it come from? But it sits very deep. And of course, the Anglican Church, since the Queen is also the head of the Anglican Church, is very deeply embedded in especially English sense of self. So that's historical. And then there's political legal. It makes a big difference if you've got a Napoleonic law code, the way we have it, or when you have a common law code. So laws land differently in a common law system than in a Napoleonic law system. And so it feels much more as an intrusion and as a Fremdkörper, as a sort of alien element in your law system when you have a common law system. And in their common law system without a constitution, the role of parliament is far more important. And so to see parliament's power curtailed hurts much more. Then there were some really good arguments against the EU, looking at the political element of why Brexit. The EU, Brexiteers, most Brexiteers will come to this in a minute, are clowns, but there are a number of really smart people there. And I think one of the most sad outcomes of Brexit in its current form is that it delegitimizes that group. Because if you're now seen as being part of the Boris Johnson, Nigel Farage clown show, nobody listens to you. But a number of people have made very good points about the EU being fundamentally undemocratic. Not in the sense that there isn't a whole process of ratification by democratically elected politicians, but the Brexiteer point is that democracy is also the system where there is the forging of a common will. And so citizens that together make up the democracy will come together and decide on their fate. And for that, of course, you need a public opinion in which options are discussed, priorities are hashed out, and ultimately boil down into several options, and then there's an election, and depending on which group faction wins, that's the way the community goes. Now, that is almost entirely absent in the EU. What happens in the EU is that compromises are negotiated behind closed doors and then ratified by national parliaments. And I think this happens time and again, and now with the European army, where there has not been any call for a European army among European citizens. Instead, Jean-Claude Juncker at some point says, well, we really need a European army, although we won't call it a European army, it isn't really a European army. And then all the time when you say, well, shouldn't we discuss the pros, the cons, the dilemmas around the European army? No, it's fine. And then ultimately, suddenly there's a European army, and then you have two choices. You can either vote for the mainstream parties who will then go along with the European army without having made a case for it, or you can vote for the so-called populists. And Brexiteers say, that is not democracy. And ultimately, according to them, the chief reason to leave the EU is because the EU will collapse, because there is no European demos. And you cannot have a democracy without a demos. And I think these are very powerful arguments. I think there are even more powerful arguments personally on the other side. But it's very interesting how European leaders and Europhiles and believers in the cause have never really engaged with this criticism. And I mean, there is no European public opinion at the moment. And so big is beautiful. is another, big is not beautiful, is another argument by the intelligent Brexiteers. As I said, what made Europe so powerful and so innovative in the Middle Ages was that it was decentralized. You had all these little city-states, and they could experiment, and if a city-state blew up because it made stupid experiments, well, too bad for the city-state, but everyone else could go on. And right now, more and more, there's a centralizing power that tries to control education, that tries to control more and more elements of life. And so Europe is losing what made Europe Europe, which was its essential diversity. And diversity is then reduced simply to languages and cooking and dancing, rather than different political systems that can compete and learn from each other. And then there's, of course, the argument, the political argument in favor of Brexit, that you simply cannot manage a 500 million an entity of 500 million. And that their slogan was, we need to shorten the chains of accountability. So look at America, how everybody hates Washington. That's what happens, the Brexiteers say, if you've got an entity of 500 million. It is simply not possible to feel a connection when there's 500 million of you towards the center. So these were strong, in my view at least, strong arguments of a political and legal nature. Now, on top of that, the historical reasons and the geographical reasons. I think that this is the kind of the backdrop against which Britain's whole problematic and awkward relationship with the EU, from the moment they tried to join and were rebuffed by de Gaulle and then finally joined in '74, played out. Now, then I think 23rd of June 2016, a rainy day, and 52% of those who bothered to turn up vote to leave. How did that happen? I think there are two chief elements here. One is just what is often in the scientific literature called a Armageddon clusterfuck of miscalculations. If you look at them, it's really quite astonishing. So it starts out that Britain principally has a two-party system, but over time the Liberal Dems, kind of D66, except a bit more intelligent, doesn't take much. The Lib Dems, and then the Conservatives and Labour. And so when David Cameron, the then Prime Minister, made his promise of a referendum, he did so in a coalition government. And he assumed that after the elections there would again be a coalition government. And so what he did, he made that promise for a referendum, knowing that this was, a bit of red meat for the Eurosceptic backbenchers, but he was sure that the Lib Dems would demand the revocation of that promise, because the Lib Dems are more pro-EU, or as pro-EU as D66. Now, what happened is David Cameron had underestimated his popularity. So he won the elections. So suddenly he wouldn't have to be in a coalition with the Lib Dems, and so he was stuck with his promise. George Osborne, the Chancellor, Ministry of Finance, did the same thing. He assumed that he would be in a coalition, so he promised that he would cut the deficit by a tremendous, deeply cruel, utterly unrealistic margin, thinking, I'm going to be negotiating a coalition agreement with the Lib Dems, and then I'm going to trade this promise for something else. Cameron too thought, I'm going to get something from the Lib Dems in exchange for which I don't have to hold the referendum. Oh, I am so smart. That's English. The English are incredibly good in tactics. So he thought he was brilliant tactics. Now, too bad, he wins the election, so now he's stuck with the promise. Now, this wasn't so much of a problem, as long as the Brexit crowd consisted of the kind of brown shirts, clowns and idiots that it had traditionally comprised of. All that changed when Boris Johnson, the mayor of London, joined the Brexit camp. That totally changed, and you could just sense the atmosphere in London change when he announced this. I still remember where I was when I heard it, because I realized that is the game changer, because that man is so charismatic, and he suddenly pulled the Brexiteers away from this kind of marginal group about, there's a referendum, do I even bother to vote? Suddenly they had star power and they had intellectual power, because he's immensely smart. He's very well connected. He's one of those Etonians, to the best secondary school in England. And he definitely knows how to play the media. Boris Johnson himself wasn't really, well, it's entirely unclear whether he has any genuine opinions, but he had not expressed himself in an unambiguously anti-European way in the past. He'd made up a lot of stories, but he'd also made a lot of points about how he went to school in Brussels. And he thought that the best way to succeed David Cameron would be to lose honorably the referendum. Because the Conservative Party is dominated by its grassroots. The grassroots are all maniacally anti-EU. And so what Boris Johnson thought, I'm going to campaign hard for leave, I'm going to lose, and then when the next leadership contest is held, I'm going to say, I am your most anti-European, anti-EU skeptic of all, vote for me. That was the game plan. The trouble was that Boris Johnson had also underestimated his own popularity, and so he won. And there are some fantastic photos of Gove, Michael Gove, the sort of the super brainy nerd, and Boris Johnson the day after the referendum. And it's like two men at an auction holding a big Chinese vase that they didn't really want to buy. And so that was the second major miscalculation. Now you think, okay, but this is so outlandish. Surely the opposition is going to benefit. The Labour Party had a succession of very mediocre leaders who were all going along with the same kind of third way Labour Blairite, quite similar to the PvdA in the Netherlands. And so they felt that the next the leadership contest they were holding was basically offering the choice between 5 identical options. So they thought, why don't we bring in this far left old man just to offer some sort of choice. And the older man, Jeremy Corbyn, went along. He thought, why not? He had no plans nor any preparation for leadership. And then he won. And the trouble was that he had been anti-EU all along. He is part of the faction that believes the EU always has been and certainly now is a neoliberal, not a Catholic, but a neoliberal project. So it's the way right now that finance capitalism imposes its will on the vulnerable and on the working classes. And so he had been against the EU all along, and he's part of that group. So he is not going to campaign against Brexit when he's actually secretly in favor. And so he didn't really try, and he quite a few acts of sabotage against the campaign. And so Corbyn didn't really want to win the referendum. He officially was in favor of Remain, but he didn't really want to win. Then there was Boris Johnson, who also didn't really want to win. And then there was David Cameron, who never wanted to hold the referendum, but who believed, because he'd won the referendum in Scotland over independence there, that he told EU leaders a few days before the referendum, gentlemen, don't worry, I'm not the sort of chap who loses referendums. So that was that. And then there was Theresa May, who was, you should really look up on the internet the interview that Bild Zeitung did this week with Theresa May, and it is entirely Balkenende. And so Theresa May is Balkenende. So she is someone who's absolute lightweight, simply doesn't have the caliber for the leadership role she's now finds herself into, but because of a unique combination of events, she suddenly finds herself in a leadership position. Balkenende because of the Pim Fortuyn murder, and here because of the total mess, where as soon as the Leave camp won the referendum, they started fighting, and so they couldn't put forward a new candidate after David Cameron had resigned. And so it was actually Theresa May, who was Remain, who stepped in and said, I'll be the Prime Minister and I'll deliver Brexit. So there we have Boris Johnson, who never wanted Britain to leave. There's Theresa May, who's now going to deliver Brexit, even though she didn't want Brexit. And there's Jeremy Corbyn, who can't make up his mind, who deals with a parliamentary party that is all against Brexit, but voters who are mostly in favor of Brexit. It is a complete mess. And my favorite analogy is the Iraq War. It was also based on lies and manipulation. And it was even worse. nobody would still be talking about the lies about weapons of mass destruction in the head up to the Iraq War, if they had actually delivered on the promise of installing a democracy there. But the Brits and the Americans hadn't done any preparatory work. They thought they'll just roll in and the Iraqis will welcome them with rice and flowers, and then there'll be a democracy like in Eastern Europe. That kind of wishful thinking is at the core of the whole Brexit project. And if you're going to upend a 40-year relationship that affects literally every bit of your society, you need, I think, at least 5 years of meticulous planning and scenario playing. They did nothing of the kind. And the sort of factual mistakes that Britain's major politicians made in the early months of after the referendum were just astonishing. They spoke to a level of ignorance that is just, that's similar to the ignorance they had about Iraq. Except, and that's at least karma for them, this time the Brits are going to pay the price for all this and not the Iraqis. So I think that series of mass calculations is indispensable to understand why it happened now. But I would argue that it would have happened eventually anyway, because of 40 years of brainwashing against the EU. And the European Commission published a really interesting black book about fake news in the past 40 years surrounding Europe. And you just go, they've turned it into a very nice alphabetically ordered thing. And you can just, every letter, you just one story after another in the major billionaire-owned tabloid press, as well as the Daily Telegraph and the Times, some sort of bit of nonsense about the EU. And if that goes on for 40 years and nobody stands up for the EU, except for the little group of Lib Dems that nobody takes seriously, then that has an impact. And even though most people don't read the tabloids, they're not that big, they are on the kiosks, on the street, every day, and every day there are these stories. And there have been quite a few opinion polls now about what people think the EU is, and there's almost no relationship between what the EU actually is and what the majority of, especially English people, think it is. And so that amount of brainwashing, I think, would have led to some sort of departure anyway at some point, because it really seems like the elite, as well as the population, uses Europe to feel superior. So we have a rather awful health system, and our empire is shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, but at least we're not Europeans. And so they don't watch our films, they don't read our books, they don't speak our languages. They simply do not consider themselves part of Europe. And it's a highly divided country, also because it's so unfair with private schools and everything, that almost the one thing that everybody agrees on, well, at least the EU is horrible. And I discovered soon enough that if I wanted to ingratiate myself with English people, I would have to crack some jokes at the expense of Germans, always did really well, and war jokes about Germans and the EU. And so to actually say, well, actually, it's, to me, the EU is not some sort of horrible animal that has landed on us, but it's actually something that I broadly support, even though I think it needs to change dramatically. That would be a complete conversation stopper. And so I think this is how it happened. It was a combination of the English elite using Europe as a kind of a punch bag, a bag to puke in, and also a game that the Brits played, where they would constantly, when in Europe, they would say, look at our Eurosceptic public opinion, sorry, but we do need more concessions. And that was a game they played all the time. And I've spoken to quite a few high-ranking Brits who confirmed that this was the game. The Europeans want to integrate. Well, every step along the way, they're going to pay a price to Britain. And that blackmail was just institutionalized. And they still think they can pull off that trick. But of course, if you're not in the EU, you can point to your Eurosceptic public all you want. But why would Europe still care? But they still think they can play this game. And so I think this is how it happened. Now, what now? Well, I think it's the chief. If you want to see an illustration of why you should be against referenda, the UK is your country. Because what you have now is you have the legitimacy of the referendum that says we want to leave, and then there's Parliament. And so what is Parliament going to do? Parliament is sovereign. So theoretically, Parliament, especially after you've left the EU, Parliament should be able to do whatever it wants. But then there's also a decision that stands there. And so you have a fundamental constitutional crisis. When a decision of this importance, that is this ambiguous, because what did people actually vote for? Did they vote to leave the EU officially, that is to still remain in the single market and the customs union and everything? Or are they going to leave altogether? But did they realize at all what kind of economic shock that will cause? It's like a Bible text, you know. Everybody can read something else in that referendum result. And this is why you have a parliamentary democracy, because in Parliament can learn, and Parliament can go back on its opinion and then put it to the people, and whatever the people say, it comes back, and it's a back and forth. That is paralyzing British politics. And then the problem is also that the main political parties do not represent both camps. So there are a lot of Remain and Leave supporters on the Conservative side, as well as on the Labour side. So for democracy to function, you need, if there's going to be one cleavage, it needs to map perfectly onto two political parties, so you can choose. But now, if you're a Remainer, who do you vote for? But also if you're a Leaver. The fact that there was no preparation meant that they had to start from scratch, because, you know, David Cameron is a man who doesn't lose referendums, so there was no study done. And it is only in the course of the following months that Brits began to realize just how pervasive and invasive EU membership is. And somebody compared it to an estuary. So when the sea floods the estuary and gets into all the rivers. And that's what EU membership is. And so it's for example, a good example was that they appointed Liam Fox, who always calls himself Dr. Liam Fox, so I should call him Dr. Liam Fox. Dr. Liam Fox to negotiate trade deals with other countries. And they hadn't realized that as long as they are in the EU, they're not even allowed to talk about trade deals with other countries. Apart from the fact that if you're going to negotiate a trade deal with another country, that other country wants to know first what your relation with the EU is going to be. So it was practically, but also legally, impossible for Dr. Liam Fox to do anything. So he had a clown job. And so the fact that you don't even realize that you're giving somebody a job to do that he cannot possibly do. And there are endless illustrations of this. So it's quite new, you know. I grew up thinking, you know, the Brits, together with the Americans and the Russians and the Canadians, liberated us. They know what they're doing. They're so posh and smart and eloquent and illiterate and everything. And now they just make a complete mess of it. And so they continue to bluff and say, oh, the sequencing, so the decision what is going to be talked about when, that is going to be the row of the summer. You know, we'll never agree to what the EU says, and then they agree. We're never going to pay anything, then they pay. We're never going to give, we're going to decide for ourselves what the rights of EU nationals in Britain are, and then they go along with what the EU says. And so the slogan was Brexit means Brexit, for Theresa May. But the truth is that Brexit is what the EU tells Britain Brexit is going to be. And that makes complete sense. You know, if Germany has a conflict with Belgium, Germany wins, because Germany is 8 times as big as Belgium. The UK is 8 times smaller than the EU. And so it is so difficult for a political culture that has thought of itself as at least a global power, and until World War II as the global power, to suddenly realize that they are the junior partner. And all they can do is just sit and suck it up. And the Europeans have been incredibly polite and friendly and patient. But that's what's been happening, and that is what will continue to happen. Because it's not only that the EU is so many times stronger, but it also is really good at the very thing that they're now going to do with Britain, which is negotiating. Now, the Europeans are terrible at building a public opinion, where defense terms we don't mean anything, but we do know how to negotiate trade deals. We are incredibly good at that. And the Brits, their last trade negotiator went to look for another job in 1974 when Britain joined the EU. So if you're in the EU, you don't need trade negotiators. Now, that's not everything, because the EU also has trade deals with, let me see, 168 other countries. And that is a total of 759 treaties. And the moment Britain leaves the EU, those 759 treaties all stop operating. So imagine that you're going to have to train up negotiators for the most complex and unprecedented negotiation with the EU, in which you are 8 times smaller than the other negotiating party, as well as having to negotiate 759 treaties just to keep trading the way you're trading right now with those other 168 countries. And so the task is momentous. And of course they are a member of the World Trade Organization, but financial services aren't covered by the trade organization. Aviation isn't covered. And so there's such an insane backlog of just technical stuff. And all that technical stuff affects other technical stuff. And so if you are in Euratom, meaning you can import uranium for a cancer treatment, that ultimately comes under the jurisdiction of the European Constitutional Court. But you've decided you don't want anything to do with the European Constitutional Court. Then you can no longer import uranium for your cancer patients. And so every day, the civil servants I spoke to in Britain, they said we stumble on some new major discovery, like, oh my God, this also is affected. And the same is true on the other side. So the Dutch civil servants I talked to, who are responsible for Brexit, they too tell me that it's only thanks to Brexit that they begin to realize just how vast, what an EU membership really means. So if you tear off an arm, it's only then you can see all the connections of the tissue. So in the face of all that, I mean, it's no surprise that the Brits have been paralyzed. And then, of course, the Theresa May government is in complete disagreement. So there are the ones who want to stay as close to the EU as they can. Philip Hammond, the Treasury Minister, Minister of Finance. And on the other hand is Boris Johnson, the Foreign Minister, who wants to stay as far away as possible. Now that means that the moment Britain tells the EU what kind of future relationship it wants with the EU, the cabinet falls. So it cannot logically begin to negotiate, because in order to begin to negotiate, they have to spell out the preference, and that spelling out spells the end of the government. So this explains why, ever since the referendum was held, we've already wasted something like 20 months. Essentially, haggling over things we could have settled on day one. But the Brits have to temporize because they haven't worked out what they want, and they can't because they're stuck with this referendum result and then a totally divided Labour Party and Conservative Party, as well as a totally divided Conservative government, and deep fear that if this government falls, that Jeremy Corbyn comes in, and Jeremy Corbyn dreams about nationalising the railways. He is a early 80s hard left idealist, and so that puts total fear into the whole business world. So they cling to Theresa May. Please don't give us Corbyn or Boris Johnson. And that's the only reason Theresa May still has a job, is because nobody wants her job. You want the job of Theresa May's successor. So somebody has to blow up, and then you come in. And so everybody's waiting. So that is I think, the backdrop. And so I think it's taken some time for the Europeans to realize that the total disarray that the Brits are in. I think that the EU has played it really well so far. It's also been very easy, because the moment the Brits spell out whether they want to stay in the customs union or a single market, technical stuff, but really will have a major impact. For the Netherlands, it will be I think a difference of tens of thousands of jobs whether Britain stays in a single market or not. Now, every country will be affected differently by whatever choice Britain makes. And so by the moment Britain announces, okay, we're definitely not going to be any kind of single market and customs union, for example, then every country will do the numbers, and suddenly the lobbying will start to minimize the impact on each economy. And so as long as the Brits don't say what they want, the Europeans can play unity. And so essentially you're heading for the abyss. That's the moment Britain leaves the EU, and if there's no agreement, it's Armageddon. But it's in the short-term interest of both drivers heading for the abyss not to change direction. So the EU is fine essentially because at least there's now unity and there's so many other major dossiers. And for the Brits, yeah, for Theresa May, she is also stuck. So that's, I think, where we are right now. And so that looks, yeah, very bad. There's also Ireland, very technical, but essentially like Jerusalem or Brussels, you cannot fix it. It is logically impossible to make all parties happy. Worse, it is logically impossible to prevent at least one party being so unhappy that who knows what will happen. So you're dealing with a highly complex situation. I think there's now the soft Brexit option, which is Britain stays in the single market and the customs union. Essentially nothing changes except Britain loses its seat in Brussels and has nothing to say about the rules that it still has to obey. The Norway model, that is off the table. Then there's hard Brexit, so they leave the single market, so there's financial services lose their 8 million special passporting rights to sell into the EU. There has to be a deal with aviation, all that sort of stuff. That hard Brexit is the most likely, except that with a hard Brexit you're going to have a border in Northern Ireland, and a border in Northern Ireland could very well mean a resumption of the Civil War, what they call the Troubles. So this is why already for 3 years I'm utterly fascinated by this, because it is like the Middle East. You cannot logically, you cannot see how this could be solved. And so it's magically interesting, but also very worrying. And the Brits still don't realize, I think, public opinion, but also lots of BBC journalists, just how momentous the departure will be. And I think there's still very much this atmosphere like, oh, they'll cut us a deal, something will turn up. This is a very popular English expression, something will turn up. We're lucky people, we always get away with stuff. And the thing is, if the EU cuts Britain a special deal and says, okay, so just for you, even though for the past 40 years you've blackmailed, disparaged and undermined us, we'll cut you a special deal. Then, of course, the next overnight, the Hungarians will demand a special deal, the Poles will demand a special deal, the Dutch will demand a special deal. No country currently wants to leave the EU because it's major benefits, especially for the elite. But sure, you would like to see a few rules changed, especially for you. So if the EU cuts Britain a deal, it will ultimately unravel the entire project. So that can't be done. But on the other hand, if Britain is not cut a deal, then the British economy will take an enormous hit. So in conclusion, I think this is where we are now. The Brits can honor the democratic decision to leave the EU, which means a hard Brexit, which means tremendous economic damage, or it can decide to go back on its decision to leave the EU, so not honor its democracy, protect its economy, but then its democracy will suffer a tremendous blow. Because one of the reasons why so many pollsters got the result wrong and thought that Remain was going to win was that millions of people who hadn't voted since the 80s turned up to vote. And they are not in the databases of the pollsters. And so, yeah, that's it. There's always, oh, turnout, we wish turnout was higher. That's another thing in Holland. In the 90s, everybody said, oh, turnout should be higher. Right now, with Wilders and Baudet, you never hear mainstream parties complain about turnout. Can these people please stay home again? And that's been the British thing too. So I think you're going to have a major backlash if the decision for Brexit was now revoked. But if you do not revoke and you go along with this, then the economy is really going to take a major hit. And Britain has a vast current account deficit, meaning every day foreigners lend Britain money, which Britain then spends on those foreigners' products. The Netherlands is the other way around. And it also has a huge government deficit. So the moment this whole facade begins to crumble, the crumbling can go very fast. Because essentially Britain has worse productivity than Italy. It is essentially a bubble economy where they're creating all sorts of ways for people. First they create real estate bubbles and bubbles on the stock exchange, and then they allow people to withdraw money from those bubbles and spend it on consumption, and that they call growth. And of course that's also to an extent the Dutch model, but the Dutch also have a real productive industry. The Germans do, the Brits do not. And so in many ways Britain is like a house of cards. And Brexit basically eliminates the entire bottom row of the house of cards, economically. So that's where they're stuck right now. And yeah, I think it's really striking how public opinion veers from one distraction to the next. So right now it's the new leader of UKIP, the fanatically anti-EU party, whose girlfriend sent a racist text and now has to resign. That's sort of, you think, wow, you're heading for the most important decision in your country's history in possibly centuries, and you're talking about this. And Macron was in Britain, because there are now more and more European politicians are coming to Britain because the British press isn't doing the work, so they have to come in and explain that there's not going to be a sweetheart deal. And then even BBC summarizes the interview as Macron, semicolon, a special deal is available. So, you know, where do you start? So it's, yeah, they're stuck, and one of the major assets of Britain is that it controls the global conversation about Brexit. So you go on Google in any part of the world, you type in Brexit, and you get the first 10 results are all either American, written by Brits, or Brits writing for British newspapers. And so I think this is one reason why the rest of the world is still, there hasn't been the kind of panic that you would have seen had France done what Britain had done. If France had left the EU the way Britain has left, British newspapers would have turned France into toast. We would have had a story every day about companies leaving, people leaving, insurance companies raising premiums, all that sort of thing. You know, as a journalist, I can dream up at least 50 of those kind of stories. But even if you write them, they don't appear in the kind of news media that dominate the global conversation. That has been a major asset for the Brits. One reason why they can lend so much money. But it's now turning against them because, of course, there's now no alternative voice correcting them. So they're still in this echo chamber where essentially it's Brits talking to other Brits about yet other Brits. And very little, you would expect after a vote like this that major newspapers would triple their foreign bureaus in Europe, because you have to know in each country what is going on and how that country may be amenable to at least helping Britain. None of that has happened. So and so ultimately I think it's a real tragedy. Now, why do I still think it's a good thing? Well, I think for the EU, I think this one reason was I think the Brexiteers made more sense than the Remainers, in the sense that the Brexiteers said the only way the European project can work is through radical further steps towards integration. So you're going to have a fiscal union, a political union, a banking union, all these unions, and according to them, there's no popular support for this. If you don't have these unions, then in the next crash, the whole thing is going to come down. That's their argument, and I think they're right. We now have this kind of hybrid where we don't really have a functioning EU, but then we don't really have a functioning sovereign states either. We're kind of in the middle, and with every crash, the building wobbles and is weakened. And so I think we either have to dismantle the thing or develop it further. But where we are stuck right now is just not tenable. The Remain camp essentially said, let's stay in the EU and use our veto to keep things in the EU the way they are, as much as we can. And so I felt that the Remainers were more inconsistent. They had not worked through the consequences of, if we really think that we're going to create a European Union with a European demos that can actually function and weather all those financial, monetary and military storms, if you're not up for that, then you should leave. And I think on the European side, now that the saboteurs have left, it is going to be much easier for us to try. Now, if you're against all this, then you're going to see the destruction of the EU that you expect and predict happen sooner, so it's good for you. And if you think that it's actually going to work, that we can integrate and have a European continent a functioning political entity, then finally we can make those steps. And of course that's about the first thing that happened, is that a number of dossiers where the Brits were using their veto to stop any further developments, defense but others too, suddenly made huge leaps. And so I think it was good for both, especially good for us. The way it was good for the Brits, it's at least now they have to deal with the situation they've created, and they've always wanted to benefit from a project that they didn't want to see succeed, and that created such an awkward and such resentment and bad blood. And now they just have to deal with the question: okay, do we want to be a sovereign nation that is irrelevant, or do we want to be part of this bigger thing? Meaning that we're going to have to pull lots of sovereignty and accept that a lot of decisions affecting us will be taken by Europeans and not by us. So it forces people to face up to choices they're going to have to face up anyway. And I like to think that's always a good thing. So this was why hence my fist pump when the result came out. And I think slowly people are coming around. There's more and more thinking that Brexit could be a blessing in disguise for the EU. And whether the Brits work it out, it's difficult to say. Then the Scots may very well leave. Northern Ireland looks really bad, so I'm very sorry for my British friends. But it's not my fault that their fellow Brits were brainwashed for 40 years by a billionaire-owned far-right newspapers. So yeah, that was my thing. Actually,
You know what? Thank you very much. Joris Luyendijk really put as a clear statement, the Dutchman who turned into a Brexiteer, probably not overnight, but quite unsurprisingly, but also facing us with a puzzle, a dilemma, because you talked about too big isn't good for the EU, and a friend of mine talked about the beauty and the Brexit, and then the EU might be the beauty, but actually now I also may look, well, isn't it the Brexit and the beast? So what remains, and isn't it what wishful thinking that the EU will improve, not too much wishful thinking, because it has to be realized after all, also in terms of Europe's security. So isn't there a special deal in the making in the end if Macron is already heading at that and the border with Northern Ireland will remain open? There will be a transitional arrangement for 2 years. The people in the EU living in the UK will remain to stay. Isn't that a special deal in the making already?
well, I think it's the EU will probably allow the Brits to say it's a special deal. And so the last time that Theresa May buckled and she had to give in and do what the Europeans said, she went home and said victory. Yeah. And all the billionaire-owned far-right newspapers said victory. And the great thing is, because the EU isn't a country with elected politicians who are then challenged by journalists, they just let her. So the Brits are probably going to be allowed to claim their defeat as a victory. Except that, of course, once the economic cycle turns and the Europhobes across Europe have the wind in their sails again, then I think the Brits must be seen to suffer. But I think that will happen automatically. There's such an exodus already of talent. And so the economic damage will be quite visible. And if they muck up the transition, and so they crash out of the EU in March 2019 without any kind of deal, that just means lorries stacked up in 3 rows from Dover to London. All European nationals in Britain losing their professional licenses, all Brits in the EU losing their professional licenses, no plane getting off the ground anymore from Britain to Europe or vice versa. I mean, that makes for some really powerful pictures. So I think they're going to end up in a transitional phase where everything remains the same and the Brits just keep on complaining. But ultimately they've then lost in that transitional phase their political power while still having to obey the rules of the EU. That is, I think, a situation that the Europeans can live with, and the Brits will just slowly leach and lose, because ultimately, of course, you're not going to invest in a country that will be paralyzed by uncertainty for years to come.
So, a bad situation, but in the end better for
I think
for
we're doing
Europe.
quite well.
Yeah.
Yes, I mean, it's like in almost every scenario, we come out better than they are.
It's really a zero-sum game, like you portray it like that. But anyway, we go to questions for the audience. There will be 2 microphones. So please make your question, remark to the point, and we start right up there.
Yep. well, hello. You brought up that Britain finds the EU undemocratic due to a lack of European demos, and that's fair enough. So then I'm curious on what is the current discussion on Britain's own voting system, as, and I may be out of date with this, it's shown itself to be in recent years rather unrepresentative to the electoral base.
Yeah, that's an excellent question. I think there's first of all the House of Lords, where still some of the members have inherited their seat through the patrilineal line. In other words, you have to be a man in order to inherit a seat in the Eerste Kamer. I mean, even Iran doesn't have that kind of hereditary seats in parliament. But much worse is their first past the post system, where you can have 37% of the votes and end up with 60% of seats in parliament. And so, for example, UKIP had 4 million votes in the general election and not a single seat in parliament. And what was so interesting is that because the European elections are using proportional representation, UKIP did get a massive vote, a massive amount of votes for the European Parliament. And so they started their whole campaign from the very European Parliament that they wanted to abolish. So that's another fantastic paradox where without European proportional representation democracy, Britain would still be in the very organization that they claim is undemocratic. So they have some very serious issues. I'd say that Britain needs to go through some far-reaching modernization and democratization, and this may again be an opportunity. But they may also clamp down. They had a referendum on proportional representation, and it was won by the same guy who won the out referendum by essentially just using lies and fear. It's very effective. Lies and fear.
Yeah, question in front of to the left here.
Thank you. I was wondering, because at the end you talk about that it can be good for the UK, but that requires a sort of self-reflection that they haven't shown. So why should we be optimistic that they're going to show this self-reflection in the coming years and not go more to the nationalistic standpoint that you're talking about? Because that would be quite dangerous, I think.
Yeah, I agree. And there's this strange kind of sense of superiority that somehow the British public opinion is immune to fascism. Now, we have too much sense of humor for fascism. We're never going to march the streets in a brown shirt. You know, I mean, that's just silly. And so, yeah, I think there's a real danger. And that's, I think, also where the EU has to be very careful not to push the English too far, because they still need to be able to pay their bills for NATO, so they can defend us, because they've got a really good army. I think Britain is a big tent, and so there are different groups, and some of them are disenfranchised by the current media political setup, but they could really surge. And I mean, I think Jeremy Corbyn has been very disappointing in it. It's the moment he got power, he started lying, like the very leaders he always criticized. But the fact that he is now running the biggest political party in Europe, that there is a massive groundswell, I think, for change. So yeah, it could go either way. But there is a risk and a danger, especially with the Americans. I would venture the opinion that had Trump been elected for Brexit, Brexit wouldn't have happened, because people would have gone, oh wait. They were really counting on Americans giving them a fantastic deal, also because they believed that they could have a deal before they'd left the EU and they hadn't studied the details. But there was also a sense that we belong with the Americans anyway. We're essentially the 51st state, but there's a bigger piece of water between us. And now with Trump, it's manifestly uncomfortable. But I think there's also a chance of if they would take on those 5 billionaires who control those far-right newspapers. And it's been tried over phone hacking, and they narrowly missed it. Murdoch's attempt at controlling even larger slice of the British television market has just been blocked today. And I think that is I hope to think that bears witness to the idea that there is a growing realization that their far-right newspapers have become a political liability.
So, yes, there's a question up there, right up there.
We should have one of those things.
Yeah, we have microphones like domino stones. But
Yeah.
So I was wondering, you told about this web of lies that has been building over 40 years, and then all sorts of inconsistencies that start to show up, ultimately the truth must come out. It will start showing with economic collapse or something. At some point people must realize that they have been lied to, right? Do you think that will happen? That there will be a reckoning of some sort?
I just hope. I mean, I've really grown to love the place, and it has so much to give the world. It's just astonishing if you realize that there are 4 times more English than Dutch, and you try to name even one interesting international Dutch writer, director, journalist, philosopher, thinker. There's nothing. And Britain, I just one list after another. It's an astonishingly richly creative place, and so I really hope that they pull out, and they may actually become. I think London could become to the EU what New York is to America. It is a kind of at a distance with the finance industry, the advertising industry, the media industry. It has so much going for it. But whether it happens, I mean, if you look at the Americans, they look at the Iraq War. What happened after the Iraq War? That the conclusion wasn't, maybe we should not, on the basis of lies and manipulation, invade a country run by a horrible dictator who we supported for 20 years before we turned against him and totally wrecked this country under sanctions, and then invade without studying what the country is actually, how it's run. That would be my conclusion. The conclusion instead has been, you cannot, Muslims just aren't capable of democracy. Vietnam War, same thing. Maybe we shouldn't invade other countries and kill lots of people there. No, it was the left who stopped us from winning. So it's I think as long as you have these almost psychopathic far-right billionaire-owned newspapers and television stations, that reckoning becomes really difficult. I've grown so grateful for the Netherlands not having billionaires owning newspapers, as well as having a proportional representation system that really guards us. We've never had a single party dominating government who could then pull out a referendum, and then that referendum being poisoned entirely by billionaire-owned newspapers. I mean, we have our own problems here, but not of this kind.
Nevertheless, the Dutch are quite disappointed that the UK leaves as a partner in the European project.
Yeah, because as long as the Brits were there, we could tell ourselves that integration wouldn't proceed anyway, so we could have the benefits of the EU without actually going through on its logical consequences. So I think we need to grow up. And I mean, geopolitical culture in the Netherlands is infantile. I mean, we just have no understanding of international power. It's really astonishing. If you just point out that we joined the Iraq War and the Afghanistan War because of our geostrategical alliances, we don't want to become dependent on France and Berlin. So we try to keep the Americans and the Brits in, and also because our corporates will be first in line with all the major orders once Iraq becomes that stable democracy. That was why we joined the Iraq War, not because of international law or democracy. If you even point this out, which is not a secret among policymakers, people call you cynical, and it's simply a description. And so I think the Netherlands has a long way to go now.
So we have
very interesting
to show our face. But next question, first over there, and then we come to the front here again.
It's a small detail, I think, but when Cameron stepped down as Prime Minister, the flamboyant and intelligent Boris Johnson did not become Prime Minister. Do you know why?
Well, the official story is that he was meant to be put forward by the Leave camp, and then the Leave camp fell out, and Michael Gove, who was his kind of intellectual mentor or the brain nerd behind the scenes, put himself forward, and so suddenly there were several candidates being put forward, and so since the votes would then be spread, nobody came forward, nobody would win, and Theresa May won. Now, maybe here I'm being too cynical, but I think that really suited Boris Johnson. I think if Boris Johnson had become Prime Minister, he would have had to act on his promises, and he would have hit the wall really, really quick. And because Theresa May stepped in and thought, hey, why don't I become Prime Minister, even though it means that I'm now going to deliver on the very thing that I was against, she kind of saved the Leave camp.
So, okay. Yeah, here in the middle is a question. If you can pass the microphone, otherwise I will repeat it.
Yes, please could you explain how one could be proud of the EU as long as you can read in die Zeit über das Bundesdieselamt, das Frau Merkel das Geschummel über die darüber geschwiegen hat und es möglich macht, dass die alte Wagen wieder in Europa eingeführt werden von den Vereinigten Staaten. Ja? Sie ist nur für die Multinationals und weiter nichts. Wie können die Bürger dann stolz darauf sein? Ja?
Well, personally, I'd really like to go along with Rem Koolhaas, the architect, one of the Dutch people who did make it internationally, and who said, we're now in the post-utopian phase. So we are no longer going to have to say that it's all about peace. No, it's about power. And we're not going to be about, we're going to be friends and we're going to be so proud. Nay, it is going to be, no, it's simply about defending our interests. And the rest of the world is not democratic or quickly on its way to no longer be democratic. And so it's no longer about pride. And the Dieselgate was absolutely terrible. It really underlines to me the need for a European public opinion, where European public opinion would rise up and just say, Merkel, this just won't fly. And the way Germany, also in the Greek crisis, has, consistently and ruthlessly promoted its own interests and basically not been held accountable. That is really pretty depressing. But I would invite you to point to any kind of political constellation across the world or in history that you could be proud of.
Thank you. There's a question right there at the left.
First of all, I'd like to thank you for giving this lecture. It was really interesting. And secondly, on the first part of your lecture, you talked about that we, as the upper middle class of the Dutch people, we have our backs towards Germany and French. But how did you come up with that statement? Because I myself think that I know more about the German history than about the English, the Great Britain history.
That I would venture the opinion that you are then in a minority. So if you just from what I've seen of Dutch media, is their leading is what CNN does, what the New York Times does, what the Economist does. If you go to any, the right will get its Leon de Winter. If you can just simply, it's almost copy paste from his little niche of English language right wing. Perspective, and then there's the Guardian and the London Review of Books for the lefties, and the command of languages, France and Germany has plummeted. So I think even that it's a big frustration among civil servants in the Netherlands, because they realize how deeply embedded the Dutch economy and Dutch society generally is in Europe and Germany particularly, but among politicians too. They did surveys about where you go on holiday, what do you read. It's all Anglophone. And so in that sense, we're in this really strange place now, because America has gone bananas and Britain is, we don't know where they are. So we've been robbed essentially of our two lodestars.
So imagine the British will turn halfway, say, well, we rather love to stay, like Tony Blair proposed last week, or there will be a second referendum.
I think it is immensely dangerous for the EU to now just say, okay, forget about it. So I think if Britain is being let in, it must pay a price. So it has a number of opt-outs and it has a rebate, so it pays less. That should go. And so to make sure that any other European country contemplating blackmailing the EU, the way the Greeks did too with Yanis Varoufakis, is that they realize that, okay, if it doesn't work out, we suffer.
So the Greeks should lose the euro and the Brits should get it.
No, what I mean is the Greeks thought that they could blackmail the eurozone. Yeah, okay. And then the eurozone said, we'll see about that. And that was a signal to all the other countries, like, this is what happens to you. This basically what the Indonesian army did to East Timor. You think about independence, this is what happens to your little island. That is essentially what the eurozone did to Greece. Now, I think we need to do something similar to the Brits, to make sure that other countries don't start pulling at the seams. So, and that, I think there's absolutely no emotional preparedness for this. The Brits still think that its very membership was a concession to the EU. That's how Cameron talked about it. Because that's how they they are taught to see themselves all the time.
Yeah, they didn't join from the start and then voluntarily joined. But the question then still remains: what will happen with the United Kingdom, the former land of hope and glory, the Scots, the Northern Irish? You've been working there from the London perspective, to big English newspapers. What will be the future of the rest of the country?
Well, I think Scotland was about to vote for independence on the same kind of emotional, unconsidered grounds that the Brits then left the EU. They really hadn't done the work. And the SNP has also been playing lots of games with numbers. And I think so as long as the oil price remains low, it's very unlikely for Scotland to become independent, unless, of course, the situation south of the border changes radically. And there was a two-thirds support for remain in Scotland. And Scotland is a really different place from Britain. It's north of the Limes. Where the Romans never reached Scotland, and Scotland has always struck me as a quintessentially Northern European country. And their argument for independence was always that the Tories are going to destroy the welfare state. We have to guard the welfare state. So in that sense, the Scottish independence movement is very different from the Flemish. The Flemish are right-wing neoliberals who want to get rid of those poor Wallons, whereas the Scots are actually being subsidized by the English, but are worried about losing the subsidies and then say, well, maybe we should go it alone. And so they haven't played it very well. And then Northern Ireland, I was in Ireland in November, and they're so worried. And they tell me, that we have a whole generation who has no physical memory of war, who are now in their 20s. But the ones older than that, they still bear the scars. And it requires essentially 10 people with a big weapon in order to turn the whole thing upside down again. And the way that Theresa May has now, gone into bed with the DUP, a insane anti-abortion, creationist little party from Northern Ireland, already undermines the peace process horribly, because the British state was meant to be neutral in the peace process. So in the end, the union that may collapse may not be the European Union. Lots of Brexiteers said the European Union is about to collapse. If we pull out, the whole thing falls apart, and then we'll step in and reorder Europe. So we have the most famous, The Trouble with Europe, the most famous anti-EU book ends on that note. Let's reorganize Europe by creating this instability. In the end, it may be the United Kingdom that falls apart.
Yeah, so not only uncharted waters for the EU, but troubled waters for the UK as well. There's a question, at the front here, and then at the front here. Yeah.
The major arguments in the Brexit was that the Brexit would provide wealth for the UK.
Yep.
How could people like Nigel Farage, who promised, I think, 200 million to the people, have that based on realistic arguments, if even cities or even companies in the city already said that they might leave after Brexit?
Yeah, the claim was, what they did is they looked at surveys, and they discovered that the thing that worries British people most is the thing that worries everybody in the West most, which is access to healthcare. And so they then went along and said, okay, if we leave the EU costs, to 350 million pounds a week, and so we'll be able to give that to the health, the NHS, the health sector. That is one hospital a week. Now, if you're a low information voter, that sounds like a fantastic deal. Also, you've been brainwashed for 40 years to think that the EU is just this Catholic German extortionist project that just sucks Britain dry and holds Britain back. You've never been told about all the ways that Britain benefits. And so I think that the key was not the number. It wasn't even the lie, 350 million. What the key was, and it was brilliant, is to frame our membership costs money. And whether it was 350 million or 150 million, that didn't matter. It costs money. Whereas in reality, your membership, makes you a lot of money, because there's so many benefits from, for example, medicine. If you don't have to test medicine in 28 countries, but in one, a child can understand how much money that's. But it also costs money, the EU, because you have to maintain these agencies and then these insane salaries for people working in Brussels, as well as structural funds to help countries whose markets are opened and are subjected to competition from much stronger countries. There's a logic behind it. That logic has never been explained. And as long as these far-right newspapers are in control, it won't be explained. That's just the painful fact. If in the Netherlands, journalists at NRC or Volkskrant discover they're wrong, they change their mind. There isn't some owner, Rupert Murdoch, who will then fire them. But if you get fired for not towing the line of the billionaire, you will tow the line of the billionaire, or you will leave the newspaper and nobody will hear from you. So it's no longer a self-correcting public opinion.
Two questions over here and then up there.
Well, thanks for your talk. I got a question about news outlets in the Netherlands. I had the feeling that they really had a frame about the financial markets plummeting, that people regretted voting for leave, etc. Was that like a Dutch thing, or was there actually a feeling like that in the?
No, there was no, and then there's still very little buyer's remorse or support, shifting of support. And this story about Brits looking up what is the EU the day after the referendum. Yes, there were a few thousand who did that, and that was much more than before. But it was absolutely, it was from such a low base. It was absolutely no, it wasn't fake news. It was deeply manipulated thing. And so I think Europeans like to project onto the Brits this idea like they're rational, so they've done something stupid, and now they realize they've done something stupid. Now that initial element, they're rational. They don't realize what they've done. They've just done something stupid, but they still think they've done something smart. Or it's just sort of that, well, it has happened, let's get on with it. But how momentous it is and how much they're going to suffer economically if they're really going to have a hard Brexit, especially when they crash out, that it still hasn't landed at all. And it's all being discarded as fear-mongering, doomsday, blah, blah, blah.
Certain moment you wrote, keep calm and carry on, but they're not keeping calm, and they're not carrying on anyway.
No, this whole idea of the Brits as, pragmatic and stiff upper lip, you should really read the Daily Mail. The upper lip is not stiff. It just goes and it's foaming at the mouth.
Okay, there's one upper lip here. Thank you.
Thank you for your insight. So I was wondering, with Britain we have some distance, so we can laugh about their cultural delusions because we have this kind of disconnectedness. So I was wondering, with your time living there, do you have the same kind of now the distance to the Netherlands, and with this analysis that you can tell us a little bit about our own delusions, similar to the Brits, because we can laugh like, haha, they're so stupid, but we're probably just as stupid.
Yeah. No, I think the delusions in the Netherlands are really different. In Britain, they are about grandeur. We could be a world power again. Everybody knows us. Everybody cares about us. If I tell colleagues in Britain that it's become impossible for me to sell stories, because I write for a range of European newspapers, to sell stories about Britain because nobody in Europe cares anymore. That's almost impossible for them. It's front page for them. They think they have this centrality illusion. That's their, like the Americans. But I think ours is just naivety. Is it that we don't really need an army? We don't really need really strong security services. We don't really need all these things. Some bad things stop at the border. And it's, for example, the spying agencies in Britain, they spend most of their time on spying industrial espionage. So they help British companies spy on Dutch companies in order to find out what the Dutch companies are doing. The Dutch people go, no, they won't do that. And so I think that, naivety is the ultimate luxury product. Because naivety cannot be self-reflexive. You can't be aware of your naivety because then it's gone. And so on the other hand, it makes for a very nice society where people are very open and trusting and they share information easily and it's very informal. That's all very nice. But we've been incredibly lucky. We've been on the right side of Germany. If we had been Poland, different history. And somehow, the water just flows in a way that makes Rotterdam the biggest port. And then we totally screw over the Belgians by not allowing their port to become big, and we do forget about it. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about what we did in Indonesia. And so there's this mixture of it's not really hypocrisy, because hypocrisy, you know what actually happens. There's a willful blindness in Dutch political culture, and I think it's now being upended by the Zwarte Piet people and Gloria Wekker, and I think it's very welcome. But it will also make for a more grim society, I'm afraid.
Okay. Thanks. Let's cross the channel again for the last round of questions.
Can you explain why most older British people voted in favor of Brexit, and lots of youngsters, as far as they stayed not at home, they wanted to remain to Europe? Has it to do with Churchill or Queen Victoria, or? I think
to an extent, it's hard to generalize, obviously. I think the best predictor, by the way, was not age of social class or education. Does anybody know what the best predictor was for what people voted? Support for the death penalty. So if you supported the death penalty, you were almost certainly a Leave voter. It's one of those, okay. So there's also the authoritarian personality element here. But I think generally, the older you are, the more the more lively your memories are of the time when Britain was a sovereign place that could set its own rules, that could dictate its conditions, that kept calm and carried on. And indeed, I think, but this is going to take so long that by the time Britain actually leaves the EU, many of those older people have died. So if you would hold the referendum again and give only the right to vote to those who voted in the referendum, you will find that then Remain wins. I think changes have gone very fast, and it's older people. It's also just London to concentrate, like Paris, like concentrate all these economic and cultural functions in one place, and London just sucks capital and talent to itself, and then becomes an almost unlivable place because it becomes so expensive. There have been a lot of political decisions, especially taken by Thatcher, but also Blair, also contributed to this sense. And I think a lot of the aggression against London was diverted to Brussels. People were, if you listen to them, often what they were angry about was not what Brussels did, but what London did. But London very cleverly said, no, the evil people are there. They speak with funny accents.
Thank you. Before last question, yeah.
From an European point of view, you make a very strong story about the how and why of the Brexit. But I would guess that the British are themselves also reflecting on what has happened. So this story would be appreciated there or not?
Well, I have found my little niche in deeply insulting the English for their stupidity, and it does really well in a little pocket of sort of Remain progressives. So I did one piece for Prospect, which is a progressive magazine, and which went on to become the best read piece in the history of Prospect, which lined up this argument essentially. But it's generally speaking, this is still a subject where it's Brits about Brits, and there's very little. If they allow in a big voice, they're Americans. So I think the Guardian has 4 or 5 American columnists, and then one French who does the European perspective. Of course, I mean we've got quite a few. So I found it a very difficult market to break into.
So to conclude, you've been blaming the British press a lot for their ownership, and you said we were one of the lucky few Europeans to turn in. But what role should journalists play in this process to get Britain back on track?
I think it's so difficult to expose the lies and the manipulations and distortions of the billionaire-owned far-right press, because they're so good at turning that on its head. And so I think this was the reason why European politicians chose not to intervene in any kind of way in the referendum campaign, because it felt that everything was immediately turned against. So even if Tusk sends this tweet, which he did last week, like, well, we're still very sad you left, our hearts are still open. And then Macron comes over and says, I will lend for the first time in the history of France the Bayeux Tapestry. Jacob Rees-Mogg, who is one of the major Brexiteers, said, well, you lend us the tapestry, maybe we'll give you a bit of the Battle of Waterloo to remind you of who wins most battles. And where do you start? I think they need some time in the naughty corner.
Yeah, well, probably go together at Normandy beaches again, near Bayeux. Ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the Brexit lecture. The why, the how, and what next for Britain. There will be 14 months of tense negotiations and probably some time afterwards. Joris Luyendijk shared some insights, some views from British politics, British media, and the European views on that. We would like to thank you very much for your wonderful lecture. He will sign some books afterwards if you're willing to buy at least some. And of course we would like to thank you very much for your attention here, and of course would like to welcome you back at the next sessions of Studium Generale, and I wish you a very safe trip at home. Have a nice evening. Thank you very much.